So today we're moving into different types of research and the different ways we can go about asking those really good questions and testing those really good hypotheses. So we're going to start with small n and case study research. So a case, to give a definition, this is from Yin. Generally a bounded entity, so that could be a person, an organization, a condition, an event, a social phenomenon, something like that. But the boundary between the case and its contextual conditions in both spatial and temporal dimensions may be blurred. All right, so essentially, we'll be looking at a variety of cases throughout this course. Sometimes we'll be doing case studies where there's multiple cases. Other times we'll be doing a single case study. So let's just start with some single case study stuff. So we often say that the number of cases that we're doing is our n. So if we only had one, we would have one n. It's short for number of cases, or one case. But then in other political phenomena, we might have many cases to study. So for example, all of the voters in Canada, that would be a very large n, or a very large number of cases. And so the challenge is that there really isn't a firm line between those two. And so we're just going to take a look at kind of large n and small n unit of analysis before we move forward about doing these single case studies. So if you look right here, we have a little chart, and I've given some examples. We're going to identify whether it's a large n, so a large number of cases, or a small n, a small number of cases, and then what the unit of analysis is. So the unit of analysis is essentially that, remember how he says, Ian says up here, like a bounded entity. So the unit of analysis is essentially what is that unit of that case. So here's an example, a random sample of 1,000 protesters at a G8 summit. All right, so our unit of analysis here would be the individual. So essentially we're looking at individual protesters, so the individual person or individual human. And so we have 1,000 of them. We're doing a random sample of 1,000 from many more. So this would be a large n. Now, what is the number that distinguishes large n and small n? It really depends on your domain of research. In what I kind of do, you know, with a lot of statistical work, I kind of want like above 100. So large n might be around 100 and more, but really it depends on which area of research you're doing. So you could give me a case why that is large or small. Freedom House scores, so we talked about those before, so that the unit of analysis is the country. And then I would say that because there's like 160 some countries, I would put that as a large n as well. All NATO member states, so that again is the country is the unit of analysis. And so now we get into kind of the fuzzy area, right? So we would probably want to look up how many NATO member states are there. You guys probably know this off the top of your head. Let's see how many there are. 30. Okay, so 30 NATO member states. Is that large or small n? I'm gonna put it in the small n category, but you could make a good argument why that's actually large, because in some cases you have way less states to look at. Military colleges in Canada. So the unit of analysis is the school or the college. We have 3-ish, 2 and a bit, if you consider like CFC and Saint Jean, and then RMC Kingston. So that would definitely be pretty small n. So the two key things that I needed to make sure that you guys know is your n, which is the number of cases, and then also the unit of analysis, meaning are we studying individuals or country or school? What is that bounded entity? All right, so now we're going to move into the how we do a case study. How do we study a case? So there are 6, there are probably more than 6, but I'm just going to identify 6 different ways we can get information about a case, because obviously if we want to study it, we need some information. So I'm going to give you some examples of these as I describe them. So direct observation is just what it sounds. It's where you go as a researcher and you directly observe, you directly watch the case unfolding. So here's an example. So I have colleagues who do work on election campaigns and how micro-targeting works. And so what they did is they actually went to a select number of campaigns during an election and actually observed the campaign at the headquarters, you know, on the streets. What exactly were they doing? And so this direct observation, we're going to talk a little bit about the advantages of observation, but they were able to actually see what was going on, not just what those parties might have reported that they were doing during the campaign, but they actually got to see what was going on behind the scenes. Another means of observation is participant observation. So that's where the researcher is both participating and observing. So they're gaining the trust of those people. So they may be able to tackle more sensitive things or things that they normally wouldn't have access to if they were just a researcher randomly coming in. So this, of course, is the example of, the person who goes to the very remote village and lives with the people and does research with them. So that's kind of a bit of a cliche for that kind of research, but it could also be something like if I were to study the RMC culture and community. I am a participant in that, but I'm also researching it. Now that, of course, comes with a heck of a lot of ethical concerns, so tread with caution. Interviews are pretty self-explanatory. We're going to talk more about that later in the course. We'll do a whole week on interview methodology, but essentially that's where you actually go and ask people about that particular case. You'll have either structured questions you want to ask, or maybe it might be semi-structured, so you can kind of get a sense of what they want to talk about, and adjust your questions accordingly. But again, we'll talk more about that in a bit. Archival records, that's where you would go through documents in the past. Maybe you head on over to the National Archives and you take a look at the Hansard records. So Hansard's the recordings of what had happened in the House of Commons every day. And so you kind of go through the past and you get information about your case that way. You can also use other documents, so that could be government records, it could be computer files, it could be really any other, personal correspondence, any other written documentation. You might use an Access to Information Act to get, copies of different reports and internal documents about your case, if it was about the government. And then physical artifacts, so something like archaeology, or looking at actual things from the past. And so, all 6 of those can be done in political science. Some of them you're going to see more often than others. Generally, these sorts of methods are much more common than something like looking at physical artifacts, although it's totally still possible. So let's look at some advantages and disadvantages of 2 broad means, because honestly, observational methods versus the more archival document methods. All right, so observation methods. One advantage is that it is definitely firsthand and it's not mediated. So like the example I gave of the researchers who observed how a campaign was running from the inside, they didn't get any sort of mediated understanding of what was going on in that campaign. They got to see firsthand. So, the campaign might report, oh yeah, we have 100 volunteers every day. Okay, but then they're actually sitting at the campaign office and they're saying, I've only seen, 50 people come in to get their canvassing packets for today or whatnot. So you're not necessarily mediated through what people want you to get out of that experience. Now, there are, of course, lots of disadvantages too. So disadvantages, they could change their behavior. So your participants might change their behavior. So for example, in the campaign example, maybe the campaigners or the candidate would make sure anytime you're around that they're working super hard to give off a good impression of their campaign, or maybe they would be fudging the numbers in reality, but because you're there, they've changed their behavior and they're doing everything by the book. You might also get some bias of the researcher, so you might get to know these people, you might get to really enjoy them, and they offer you pizza at the end of the night and you like pizza. And so, you might develop your own biases based on who you like, who you don't like. And then there's a whole heck of a lot of issues with access. So, what campaign is going to really let you see what's going on, especially in their war room? There could be safety issues, maybe not in an election campaign, but if you were observing how the Canadian military is working in Iraq, then maybe, it could be dangerous for you as a researcher to be going there. And then there's the money issues. You need to be able to be somewhere for a long period of time to observe what's going on. And they might just not give you access. yeah, so like sometimes it's hard just to get people to let you in, and that requires cultivating a lot of trust over a lot of time. So the advantages and disadvantages of the documents or records methods. So first of all, the most obvious example is that the record is long lasting. So it makes historical research possible. It makes research after the fact possible. So I couldn't study that campaign using observation after it happened, but I could do it using documents and records. So it's not one of those situations where you got to get the info now or else it's gone. It's instead something where the historical information is possible. You can have multiple people take a look at the same records and come to different conclusions, as opposed to the observation where not everybody can be there at the same time. Some disadvantages, though, of document or record methods is you really only, again, get to see what people want you to see or read what people want you to read. You know, if they're going to maybe black out some of the information they don't want you to see. They might, in their report, make it sound like they're doing everything perfect, but they're actually not in reality. There might also be issues of inequality in terms of whose voices get recorded over time, and also whether you have access to classified documents or other things that maybe you don't have access to as a researcher. So there's definitely disadvantages and advantages to each of these information sources about cases. So then, how exactly do we go about doing a case study? Like, what's the methodology involved beyond just like getting information about a case? So doing a case study is essentially doing a detailed analysis of this phenomenon that we want to understand. So the kinds of questions you're going to ask in a case study are different than they're going to be in other types of research. So things like, why did this thing happen? Why did it happen this particular way? How did it happen? We spent a lot of time over the last few weeks about testing hypotheses, and we're going to get back to that. But just for today, we're looking really in case studies in the sense of a single case study as opposed to cross-case research that we've been looking at to this point. So here's a chart that explains the difference between single case studies and cross case studies. So essentially where you have one case study you're looking at versus where you might have a whole bunch of them that you can test some hypothesis with. So yeah, so the first one is the hypothesis. So can you test a hypothesis? And usually in a single case study or a really small n case study, the point is to generate the hypothesis instead of actually testing it. So we only have one, so we can't necessarily test the hypothesis, but we can come up with really interesting hypotheses. Oftentimes the best hypotheses come out of looking at a unique phenomenon and saying, I wonder why that happens. And then you can go and do cross-case studies or more large N research to try to figure out why that thing happened. Generalization. So generalization just essentially means, does this phenomenon apply to the specific case I'm looking at only, or does it also apply to the rest of the cases that I'm not looking at? And so you have very limited ability to generalize based on one case study because, again, it's just one case study. But it is possible to give more generalization, essentially more saying that this phenomenon will apply in more cases than just what I'm studying in a cross case study because you have more cases that you're looking at. So causal insights, remember we looked at causality. So what you're doing in a case study is you're really trying to get a sense of the mechanism versus the effects. So, when we were looking at, X leads, didn't turn off my Wi-Fi. X leads to Y, for example. And in a case study, we might be able to start moving in a cross case study, we may get to start moving in the direction of, this thing causes another thing. But here we're really interested in digging deeper into this causes, right? What is the mechanism? What is the thing that is linking those two variables? And then finally, a single case study or a small n case study, you can go really deep, whereas in a cross case study, when you're looking at, say, a whole bunch of countries, you have to go much more broadly. So I might be able to talk really specifically about an election campaign in Kingston and the Islands riding, but I can't say much about ridings in general and elections in general. If I did a cross case study of all ridings in Canada, I probably wouldn't really ought to have turned off my Wi-Fi. I'll do that later. All right, probably if you're looking at all of the ridings, I can't say much specifically about Kingston and the Islands, but I can say a little bit more about ridings in general in Canada. So electoral districts in general in Canada. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. So now we're going to talk about the two types of case studies we might want to do. Descriptive case studies and theory testing case studies. So a descriptive case study is essentially where you want to describe a phenomenon. And that's really important groundwork that needs to get done, because if you don't know anything about the case, or no researchers know much about the case, then you really can't move on to doing any sort of theory testing stuff, because you don't really know much yet. So essentially, this is the aim of building a new research agenda. So the first step would be to identify the case and the questions you might have. To identify the scope, you really need to have limits and boundaries, or else you can just go forever about your research. You need to identify where you might be able to get information about your case. You'll describe what you found and suggest future research. So for example, this is a study that I actually did, and we're going to look at it later on when we talk about interviews. So the case was that I noticed that electoral reform fails miserably in Canada every time it's put up for a vote. Specifically somewhere like BC, where they've had like 3 referendums now on electoral reform and they just keep failing. So I might be specific about my boundaries, that I want to study the failure of electoral reform in British Columbia. So what questions do I have? Well, why does it keep failing? What do citizens really think? Is it just that they don't care, or are they really opposed to a different electoral system? Is it the way that they were asked to give their opinions and decide about it? And I may get information about this case. If we could go back to part 2 over here. I can't really observe the referendums because they're over, so I can't do much observation, but I could do interviews with citizens. I could interview people who are involved in the campaigns. I could interview policymakers. I could look at documents or records. Essentially, I could look at the report that Elections BC has put out. I can look at government policies. I could look at internal documents. Maybe not physical artifacts in this particular case, but definitely documentary records. So there's a variety of different ways I could go about doing that. And then what I would do then is describe what I find and suggest some theories that might want to be tested. So maybe I'll get a theory from this. And this is the theory that I later test in another paper, that it's about the education that people have. It's about the status quo bias. And I wouldn't know that theory to test if I hadn't originally done a descriptive case study. The second second step, I guess, or a second way of doing a case study is a theory testing case study. So we want to know if a case confirms a theory or refutes it. And the aim is to further refine that theory. So there's 2 scenarios you might encounter. The first one is pretty easy to understand. It's a failed most likely case. So it's when a case really ought to confirm the theory, but it doesn't. And we'll get to an example of that in a second. A successful least likely case, on the other hand, is when a case really should refute a theory but ends up confirming it. This one you're going to find a lot less. I'll be honest, I found it really hard to come up with a good example in actual research on this one, because I think it's less common to see. The way they describe it in the textbook is actually fantastic. It's the Frank Sinatra test. So if the theory can make it here, it can make it anywhere, essentially. So let's go through some examples. So we're going to classify each of the following scenarios according to questions. So what is the theory being tested? Is it failed most likely or a successful least likely case? Why does the case not fit with our expectations, if it doesn't? And how might we refine our theory? All right, so the first one, so we theorize that wealth will lead to democracy. So what is the theory being tested here? Well, it's this theory that if you're richer, you're more likely to be democratic. And we've looked at this before, so we have a good sense of that theory. So we do a study of the United Arab Emirates, one of the richest countries in the world, but we find that the country is not democratic. All right, so is this a failed most likely case or a successful least likely case? So I would say what's going on here is our case, so the United Arab Emirates, it's supposed to confirm our theory, but actually, because it's super rich, and so it should confirm that we're going to get a democracy, but we find that it is so not democratic. So we have a failed most likely case. The most interesting thing now to do is to think about why does this not fit within our expectations. It could be issues of measurements, it could be certain conditions. In this case, I would say this is an issue of the type of wealth. So we know that depending on the way that a country gets its wealth can have a huge impact on whether it's democratic or not. So in the case of oil wealth, so you can look at Ross's article, Does Oil Hinder Democracy? You can just Google Scholar it, it's all over the internet. Essentially, this was one of the first papers, maybe not the first papers, but one of the key papers that really took a look at this phenomenon of all these oil-rich countries not being democracies. The idea being that the wealth stays at the top and is not flowing down to the rest of the population. Therefore, the rest of the population is not demanding democratic rights. And then also the fact that, you know, in some ways with oil wealth, you can kind of buy off some of the pressure. And so we might refine our theory that we don't necessarily theorize that wealth will lead to democracy. It's that we theorize that wealth that is not natural resource wealth, that's going to lead to democracy. So we're able to refine our theory. All right, next one, bear with me. I came up with this because I spent way too much time trying to think of an example. Yeah, so this is not the best example, but we're going to go with it today. All right. So we theorize that political science classes are the most popular in the college. I mean, the Royal Military College. But we know that research and methods is likely not to be popular because we think that students don't like learning statistics. True story. However, when we look at the course enrollment, we see that it is at capacity, again, true story, and actually has one of the highest enrollments in the department, even when compared with other mandatory classes for poli-sci majors. Okay. This has no bearing in reality at all. And that was sarcasm. Okay, so my theory is that political science classes are the most popular because they're the best, and political science is the best field of study, and therefore they're going to be the most popular because they are the best. All right, so let's take a look at this theory. But then I remember research and methods, which in a few weeks is going to become stats class, and people tend to kick and scream about doing stats, which I don't get, but like it's a thing. You know, people always don't love their stats class. So maybe it's not going to work. So let's see if we can make it with research and methods, then we can make it anywhere, right? We look at the course enrollment. We see that it's at capacity, has the highest enrollments, one of the highest enrollments in the department. Very true. And so actually, in this case, where it is the least likely, there we go, where it is the least likely to actually prove this point that, or not prove, but lend support, we'll say, that political science classes are the most popular, we actually find that it does lead support. And so if it can make it for research and methods, it can make it anywhere. Why does this not fit with our expectations? It's because research and methods taught at the college is like a super fun course with a kitty cat that does statistics. So they didn't take into consideration the fact that the kitty cat is going to be teaching statistics. That was a Zoe reference, my cat. Okay, so we might refine our theory that it depends on how the statistics or the research methods class is being taught. Yeah, bear with me. It's not the best example ever, but you know, I actually, to be quite honest, have not encountered a successful least likely case in like real research, you know, anyway. So I think we get the gist though. All right, so key considerations in case study research to sum up. So things you want to look for, a clear definition of the subject, the what, and the object, the why of the study. So we're not just going in there blind to go look at whatever we want to look at. We have a clear boundary of what we want to look at, and we have a clear why. I want to know more about why this referendum failed, for example. Or I want to know more about why poli-sci classes are so popular. Do I have a clear conceptualization? So this is where your concepts and measures are going to be super important. You know, what do I mean by popular, for example? What do I mean by the referendum failed? So again, what we learned about last week in conceptualization remains important for case study research. Process tracing essentially is looking at that mechanism or that path from A to B, and that's going to be one of the more common ways that people use case study research. And there should be one of the seminars that I've assigned uses process tracing research, and so you can get a good example of that through one of the seminars that you have to watch. And then, what are the generalizations? You know, am I overgeneralizing about how cool political science classes are based on what I've read at what I've seen at the college? Am I overgeneralizing about why referendums failed just based on what happened in BC? So you have to think about that idea that we talked about way up at the front, about this idea of, or not at the front, halfway through, about generalization and not overgeneralize from a case.